Shortly after the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit ruled that the bulk of President Donald Trump's tariffs were unconstitutional, the president posted a lengthy rant on his social media platform slamming the decision and the judges. The ruling, delivered in a 7-4 decision, confirmed what many trade experts and lawmakers had argued for months, that a large chunk of the tariffs the Trump administration had imposed or threatened were not supported by the kind of legal authority that Congress typically delegates in matters of trade and taxation. The decision came as a jolt to the administration's posture on tariffs, a cornerstone of its approach to recalibrating U.S. trade relationships and pressuring other economies to concede more favorable terms for American producers and consumers alike. In the immediate aftermath, the president's social media tirade unfolded in real time, turning the courtroom decision into a political flashpoint that amplified old debates about executive power, legislative control over taxation, and the proper boundaries of unilateral actions in the global market. From the president's perspective, the public letters and memoranda released by appellate judges did not merely strike down a policy tool. They were cast as a political attack on the very idea that his administration had the authority to use tariffs as a lever to reshape the economy. The president insisted that his unilaterally imposed import duties were both lawful and necessary for the safety of the country, and he bemoaned the enormous trade deficits used to justify his tariffs. In his view, the decision to upend the tariff program was not just a legal setback but a threat to national sovereignty, a line of rhetoric that his supporters have heard repeatedly from him in this broader political project of recalibrating the country's economic posture. The social media post itself set the tone for a renewed partisan dialogue that has long defined debates over tariffs and trade policy in the United States. The president wrote, "If allowed to stand, this decision would literally destroy the United States of America." The language was stark, almost apocalyptic in its framing, and it was designed to resonate with a base that has long embraced the portrayal of trade battles as existential confrontations rather than technical policy disputes. The post did not stand alone. It arrived as part of a larger narrative in which the administration has framed tariffs as a necessary bulwark against economic vulnerabilities, while critics argued that tariffs, especially when imposed without clear statutory authority, risk raising costs for American households and hobbling sectors that rely on imported inputs. Reaction to the president's statement among conservative and libertarian observers was mixed, with some defending the president's stance while others used the moment to re-challenge his approach to trade policy. One of the most immediate responses to the president's post came from Ramesh Ponnuru, the editor of the conservative National Review. He characterized the president's rhetoric as lunatic stuff, a swift verbal rebuke that underscored a growing dissonance within conservative circles about the feasibility and legality of tariff strategies that rely almost entirely on executive action rather than legislative consent. Ponnuru's critique highlighted a broader tension within the party, a willingness among some to defend aggressive trade tactics on nationalistic grounds while still insisting on constitutional guardrails that keep presidential powers within accepted constitutional boundaries. Across the broader market and policy commentary sphere, the online reactions included sarcasm and skepticism. Mayank Seksaria, an investor with Liberty Mutual Investments, tweeted, "Just can't stop laughing at this insane statement." The remark, though brief, captured a common sentiment among some investors and commentators who view the tariff strategy as a political maneuver more than a sustained economic policy designed to deliver predictable benefits to the public. The rapid-fire exchange of views that followed the ruling, both online and in quiet conversations among policymakers, underscored how swiftly a court decision can transmute into a broader debate about the merits and consequences of unilateral tariff actions. Among academics and legal thinkers, the response included a more technical scrutiny of how tariffs are supposed to be crafted and implemented under U.S. law. Roger Hunt, a doctoral student at Bentley University, weighed in with a cautionary note, "I'm MAGA, but this isn't how tariffs work." The sentiment reflected the challenge of reconciling a popular political message, tariffs as a tool for economic rescue, with the rigorous, sometimes esoteric requirements of constitutional and statutory interpretation that govern tariff authority. The contention here is not simply that tariffs are harmful or beneficial. It is that the mechanism by which they are authorized, enforced, and challenged within the federal system must withstand a legal standard that defines the separation of powers and the limits of executive action. Meanwhile, Nick Gillespie, editor-at-large at Reason magazine, offered a pointedly historical critique of the president's approach by saying Trump was acting like a king, King George III. Gillespie's remark drew on a long-running conservative concern about executive overreach and the idea that taxation, in particular, is a power that resides with Congress. The rhetorical flourish, "no taxation without representation," is a centuries-old nod to a core argument about who gets to decide when and how the government can levy duties on imports. Gillespie's commentary framed the court ruling as a decision that corrects a drift toward unilateral action and reaffirms the constitutional principle that Congress holds the purse strings, even as it recognizes the economic tensions that tariffs try to address. Another voice in the chorus of responses came from Patrick Giacomo, a civil rights litigator at the libertarian-leaning Institute for Justice. Giacomo posted a screenshot of Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution, which explicitly assigns to Congress the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and to lay and collect taxes. The post underscored the legal premise that tariffs are not simply policy tools used by presidents at will, they are constitutional instruments whose authority is rooted in legislative action. The juxtaposition of constitutional text with a modern policy dispute serves as a reminder that long-standing texts of governance continue to guide contemporary debates about how power should be exercised in a globalized economy. The social media arena also featured a more personal and lighthearted note from Ethan Blevins, a legal scholar at the conservative Pacific Legal Foundation. He wrote, "You know what? I'm sick and tired of this huge trade deficit I've got with my local game store. I keep buying all their cards, and they never buy anything from me. Well, no longer. I'm going to go in there and tell them to pay me for legal advice they don't need." The anecdote, while humorous, illustrates a broader instinct among some observers to translate abstract policy fights into everyday life analogies. It also hints at a broader concern about the real-world costs associated with tariffs, whether they translate into tangible benefits for domestic producers and workers, or whether they trigger price increases and reduced consumer choice. Taken together, the reaction to the court ruling and to the president's subsequent statements reveals a deepening divide over how best to secure economic strength in a globalized economy. On one side, there are calls for a disciplined, rule-based approach that respects constitutional boundaries and relies on legislative consensus. On the other side, proponents of strong executive action argue that bold, unilateral steps are sometimes necessary to challenge unfair trade practices and to protect national interests in an era of intense geopolitical competition. The exchange of views is not merely about tariffs in a vacuum. It is about the broader visions for America's role in world markets, the durability of supply chains, the resilience of domestic industries, and the daily realities faced by workers, manufacturers, retailers, and consumers who are all affected by trade policies. The specific context of this case, the so-called Liberation Day tariffs announced in April, adds another layer to the conversation. The tariffs were a central feature of the administration's economic strategy, framed by supporters as a way to recalibrate the terms of trade and to push other nations to address long-standing grievances in areas such as market access, subsidies, and regulatory barriers. Opponents, however, warn that unilateral tariffs could trigger retaliatory measures, disrupt supply chains, and raise costs for American businesses and households. The court's ruling indicating that the bulk of these tariffs were unconstitutional intensifies those concerns, while also prompting a reassessment of what, if any, tariffs remain valid and how the administration might proceed if it wishes to pursue a more targeted or legally sound approach. Within this framing, the president's insistence that the tariffs were lawful and necessary for national safety is not merely a procedural argument. It is a statement about national interest, economic sovereignty, and the perceived urgency of correcting trade imbalances. The rhetoric of a national safety argument is a common tactic in debates over tariffs, used to justify measures that lawmakers might view as instruments of policy rather than mere tax collection. Critics, meanwhile, contend that the safety argument rings hollow unless it is supported by coherent empirical projections showing real improvements in national security, manufacturing resilience, and balanced trade accounts. The truth, as with many trade disputes, lies somewhere between idealistic assurances of strategic independence and the pragmatic concerns about price volatility, consumer costs, and the complexity of global supply chains that cannot be easily rewired by executive fiat. As observers look ahead, the key questions revolve around what comes next. Will there be a legislative path to sustain or refine a tariff regime that aligns with constitutional constraints? If so, what might that path look like in terms of congressional votes, oversight, and potential amendments to trade statutes? How will markets, businesses, and workers adapt to the court's ruling, which narrows the legal space for broad unilateral tariffs but leaves room for more narrowly tailored, legally sound actions that still aim to address core economic concerns? And how will the rhetoric employed by the president and his critics influence public perception, electoral dynamics, and the broader discourse around trade in the coming months and years? The court's decision will undoubtedly shape the policy conversation. For many supporters of tariffs, this ruling is a cautionary tale about the constitutional hazards of executive overreach and a reminder that the legislative branch holds the crucial authority to define the terms of trade. For opponents, the decision validates a framework that discourages sweeping emergency measures outside the usual legislative process and reinforces the principle that trade policy should be crafted with deliberation and inter-branch accountability. The interplay between law and policy, between constitutional design and economic strategy, is precisely what makes debates over tariffs so enduring and so consequential for the direction of the country. In any event, the ruling has already become a reference point in ongoing discussions about how best to confront global economic challenges. It provides lawmakers with an invitation to revisit the statutory scaffolding that supports tariff tools, to consider reforms that balance competitive needs with legal protections, and to engage with stakeholders across industries to ensure that any future measures are both effective and legally sustainable. It also underscores the political risk of relying on unilateral actions that, while rhetorically appealing, may fail to secure reliable, long-term gains if they run afoul of the constitutional framework that governs the federal government's powers. As the day drew to a close, commentators on all sides continued to parse the implications of the 7-4 decision and the president's response. Some argued that the court's ruling will slow the administration's tariff agenda and force a more collaborative, legislatively grounded approach to trade policy. Others warned that the decision could provoke a renewed sense of urgency among policymakers who see tariffs as an indispensable tool in the broader strategy to recalibrate how America engages with the world economy. The dynamic remains highly fluid, with legal, political, economic, and social dimensions all interwoven in ways that will shape debates for months to come. For viewers following this story, a central takeaway is that legal authority, political capital, and economic outcomes are tightly linked in the realm of tariffs. The court's decision does not eliminate the debate, it reframes it. It asks lawmakers and the president to confront questions about who writes the trade rules, how those rules affect everyday life, and what kind of evidence, analysis, and consensus is required to justify sustained, large-scale tariff actions. As the country continues to grapple with questions about trade deficits, manufacturing confidence, consumer prices, and the resilience of supply chains, the resonance of this ruling will be felt by policymakers, business leaders, workers, and families who parse the costs and benefits of any policy that touches the flow of goods across borders. In closing, the narrative around tariffs remains deeply contested and highly consequential. The federal appellate ruling challenges a central element of the administration's economic toolkit, while the president's response reframes the dispute as a direct confrontation over sovereignty and national safety. The reactions, from pundits to scholars to investors, reflect a spectrum of values and priorities, a commitment to constitutional checks and balances, a concern for economic stability, a preference for legislative deliberation, and a readiness to defend aggressive policy moves that claim to defend the national interest. The coming months will test how such tensions are navigated, whether reforms can align with both legal standards and economic goals, and how the American public experiences the tangible realities of tariff policy in a complex, interconnected world.